Class, welcome to our first video lecture. What I am going to do in these video lectures is I will take the major sections of our notes. So for instance, if you look at the First Corinthians notes that you have on page 2, there are, under the book First Corinthians, there are 3 major sections. There's the nuts and bolts, there's the unique elements, and then the main themes. So in this lecture on First Corinthians, I'm going to give you 3 videos that will cover each of those points in one whole video. So you should have your notes in front of you right now. Be ready to make the fill-ins, be ready to underline and circle things that I tell you, just as if you were in class. If you have any questions or need help understanding any concepts as we get ready for the quiz on 1 Corinthians next week, feel free to ask me either via email, comment on Google Classroom, or you can meet me on Google Classroom on the Google Hangout link that I provided on Google Classroom. I will be on there every day, Monday through Friday from 8 to 9:30. So if you want, tomorrow, it's Friday, you can hop on there. If you just have a quick question or you need some help studying for anything, I will be available working away, and you just pop on that link and I'll see your face and we'll get going. All right, so I know for some of you guys, I think we're all in the nuts and bolts section. I have 2 classes, 3rd period and 5th period. I think 5th period is just a little further ahead than 3rd, and so what I'm going to do for here is I'm just going to go back to the beginning, nuts and bolts. I'm going to work through the stuff I know we have already put down, and then if you're in the class that's behind, you'll be able to get the information you need. And then if you are a little bit ahead, you could just fast forward to the place that you'd like, or you could use this as a quick chance to review what we've covered so far. So we're looking at 1 Corinthians. You've read 1 Corinthians. You've read Dever on 1 Corinthians. And so now let's talk nuts and bolts. So this is going to be a quick review. First, who wrote it? The Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 1:1 says that. Who was it written to? It was written to the church in Corinth. That's what 1 Corinthians 1:2 says. Remember, the letters state the author and the recipient in each letter. Make it easy for us to answer those questions. The city of Corinth, its location, created on the isthmus. Its history, too, was destroyed by Rome in 146 BC, rebuilt by Rome in 29 BC. Its people, greatly diverse in both ethnicity and also spirituality. Number 4, its characteristics. It is a Hellenized city. They spoke Greek and had very much Greek culture. It was a wealthy city, lots of trade happening. So think New York, very like Wall Street, lots of money being passed to and back and forth. C, it's a famous city. The Isthmian Games were held there in a regular interval. I don't know if it was 2 years or 4 years. I forget exactly, maybe even annually. But they were Olympic Games. There was wrestling and running and javelin throwing and all that kind of stuff. D, it was a sinful city. We hit all those reasons why it was a sinful city. To Corinthianize means to make someone immoral or sexually immoral, particularly. A Corinthian girl was a phrase for a prostitute. A Corinthian candle, we talked about that in class. You could tell your parents. And then a Corinthian temple servant working at the temple of Aphrodite. There were temple servants there that would actually, in honor to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, they would do sexual acts for those who come in wanting to offer sacrifices to Aphrodite. So being religious meant something very different in the city of Corinth. Paul's relationship with the city of Corinth, as you guys see here, there's an activity as we read the passages. Write down the various feelings that you'd have as Paul most likely, the feelings he most likely experienced as he went through these. So these are the cities Paul visited before he went to Corinth for the first time to plant a church. He went to Philippi, and then, as you see in your notes, then Thessalonica, then Berea, and then finally Athens. I know all of our classes went through these. By the time he comes to the steps of Corinth, he was probably fearful, tired, exhausted, maybe discouraged. He wasn't proudly marching into Corinth. He probably very likely was hobbling. He was probably at his wit's end. Then he comes up to a city that is huge, it's diverse, it is lacking any knowledge of the true God. Very few people there knew the true God of Israel. And so then we read in the book of Acts that when he went to Corinth, it was not easy. There was more persecution, there was more oppression. Those who became Christians in Corinth were attacked and imprisoned and not protected by the government. More reason for Paul to be discouraged. And so Paul, in writing to the Corinthians in chapter 2, he says this as he recalls when he first came to them. And when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty words or speech or wisdom, because I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Guys, get yourself a pastor who has that kind of ministry, where his center in ministry is telling you about Jesus and what he's done for you and helping you follow Jesus. Paul says, I've decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. He wasn't doing good. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in my wisdom, but in the power of God. In the above passages that we just read, here are our key notes. When Paul went to Corinth, he had many difficulties before Corinth. Number 2, he entered Corinth weak and trembling. Number 3, he had a fruitful ministry in Corinth. People got saved and a church was planted. 4, he had violent opposition in Corinth. Blood was shed. People were beaten up and imprisoned. And then 5, Paul had grace from Jesus. Remember, Jesus showed up to Paul in a dream saying, don't be afraid. I am with you. I have many people in this city. Continue ministering. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, preaching the gospel, helping people know Jesus and follow him. All right, back to Corinthians. Why was this letter written? Here's the historical situation. So we have 2 letters to Corinth in the Bible, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But interestingly, they're not the only 2 letters that were written. In fact, in both the letters that we have in the Bible, there are other letters that Paul refers to have written to the Corinthians, but we don't have those in the Bible. So here's kind of the background story. Take this as your Netflix, like in previous episodes. Here's the big picture of what happens in his relationship with the Corinthian church. So he, number 1, plants the church in Corinth. That happens in Acts 18. And then as he leaves to plant other churches to different cities, the Corinthians wrote him a letter, probably asking him questions about following Jesus. Remember, being in Corinth meant that they were just figuring this God stuff out for the first time. They had lots of questions. They had lots of lifestyles that they had to turn away from to follow Jesus. And so there's a lot of things that they need to get clarity on. So they wrote Paul a letter asking him questions, needing his help. So number 3, he responded to their letter with a first letter. Now, this is not 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, as your notes say, Paul says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So in 1 Corinthians, he refers to this first letter that he wrote to them. So after he sends this first letter, they read it. They probably get some help. They send another letter back with, and here's your fill-in, 3 members to Paul. You see this referred to in 1 Corinthians 16. You see the 3 church members referred to there. You can read that right there on your notes. So then Paul gets this letter from the 3 church members of Corinth. Their names are Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. And then, so he gets that letter. They probably tell Paul what's going on. He reads what's going on. They have more questions. So Paul responds with a second letter. That is 1 Corinthians. So number 5, Paul responded and sent Timothy with a second letter. You can read that referred to in 1 Corinthians 16 right there. And also Acts 19, you can see Timothy staying in Asia, which is where Corinth was. Paul stayed in Asia, and he sent Timothy to Macedonia, which is where Corinth was. So then he sends that letter, his second letter, but that's 1 Corinthians. And then they get that letter, and Paul hears, Timothy probably returned and told Paul, hey, the Corinthian church is not doing good. There's a lot of sin in the church that they haven't dealt with. And so Paul hears this, and he goes and he visits the Corinthians in person. He alludes to this in his letter, saying, guys, do you want me to come to you with a rod or in a love of spirit, or with love in a spirit of gentleness? He's going, guys, don't make me have to discipline you. Don't make me have to scold you. I want to come to you with gentleness, but if you continue walking in areas of sin and letting it happen, I'm going to need to come to you and be a little stern, like a father must be stern with his children sometimes. So he alludes to that in 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, which is actually Paul's 4th letter that he writes to the Corinthians, we're going to talk about that in a second, he talks about this painful visit that he made. I made up in my mind not to make another painful visit to you. So Paul hears this report from Timothy. He visits the Corinthian. It's a painful visit. Apparently there was disagreement between him and the church. It was not good. Paul walks away. He's just bummed out that this visit happened. The church didn't respond to him in humility like he was hoping. So then he leaves. He's not feeling good about it, so he writes them a 3rd letter. This is point 7. Paul left and wrote a 3rd letter and sent that letter with Titus. You can see that referred to and the two passages from 2 Corinthians. Go ahead and read those. Pause the video and read those. And you can see him refer to that third letter that he wrote to them. He calls it a painful letter. Well, Titus gets that letter, and Titus comes back to Paul, and he's got good news. He says, Paul, they listened to your words. They repented of their sin. They came back to Jesus. And so 8.8, Titus returned with good news. And then in response to that good news that he got from Titus, Paul sends a fourth letter. And the fourth letter that he sends to the Corinthian church is what is titled 2 Corinthians in our Bible. So Paul writes 4 letters to the Corinthians. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the ones that we have in our Bible, are the 2nd and the 4th letter. Okay, so have that relationship in your mind. Why did Paul write 1 Corinthians? So going back to 1 Corinthians, which was his 2nd letter, why did he write it? There's 2 reasons that you want to take down on your notes. Actually, sorry, 2 reasons. No, 3. Yes, 3 reasons. Paul's key reasons for writing 1 Corinthians. Number 1, to answer the questions from the Corinthians letter. Read these following verses and notice the repeated phrase, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. And then 1 Corinthians 7:25, now concerning the betrothed. Next verse, now concerning food. Next verse, now concerning spiritual gifts. So what happened is the Corinthians sent Paul a letter. He then writes 1 Corinthians answering their questions. 1 Corinthians is kind of a question-answer letter. You can almost envision Paul sitting there writing the letter, and he's looking over at their letter, and he goes, okay, they have a question about sexual immorality. Okay, let me help. I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going to explain to them how to follow Jesus with their bodies. And so he addresses all of the questions they wrote down in the form of letter. So that's the first reason Paul is answering questions. You see that with the phrase, now concerning this. He's literally going through their questions. Number 2, he writes 1 Corinthians to deal with the sinful practices of the Corinthian church. You see, Christians, when we trust in Jesus, the penalty of sin is paid for by Jesus. We're not going to be judged for our past, present, or future sins. The power of sin is now taken away, so where we can actually overcome sin in our life. We can actually live in a way that honors God and turns our back on sin. But as Christians, though the penalty and power of sin have been alleviated because of Jesus, the presence of sin is still alive in our lives. And so Christians struggle with sin. And not only individual Christians struggle with sin, but churches, groups of Christians struggle with sin. So Paul writes 1 Corinthians to deal with sinful practices of the Corinthian church. That's number 2, fill in. Here's a couple sins that we see Paul dealing with in his letter. A, the sin of divisiveness. The Corinthians were making little cliques within their church. Read 1 Corinthians 3, pause real quick, read that, and you'll see Paul talk about these little teams the Corinthians were making within the church. That's not good, because churches should be united as one family under Christ, not lots of cliques right together. So they were being divisive. Paul addresses that. B, the sin of dismissing Paul. Remember, Paul was an apostle. He had the badge where he represented Jesus authoritatively. Jesus chose Paul to be one of his authoritative messengers. Well, the Corinthian church was tempted to dismiss Paul because he wasn't this great speaker. He wasn't very impressive looking. As he said, he came to them weak and trembling. So they believed in Jesus, but they were being tempted of kind of being unimpressed and even dismissing Paul and his authority. That's a sin, because we don't want to dismiss those Christ tells us to obey, namely his apostles. So that's B, sin of dismissing Paul. C, read those passages, pause, read those passages, see that Paul is dealing with, he said, hey, don't dismiss me. I may not be this great, awesome speaker, but I am an apostle, and you need to listen to what I'm saying because I'm representing Jesus. C, he had to address the sin of abusing communion. The Corinthians, the rich Corinthians in particular, were most likely getting off work early. They would go to church. These churches would sometimes share meals together, and they'd practice communion together, which is eating the bread, symbolizing the broken body of Jesus, drinking the wine, which symbolized the spilled blood of Jesus for the forgiveness of sins. Churches are called to do this regularly together. So what was probably happening is the rich Corinthians were getting off work early, and they were coming to the meal, and they ate all the food, and they drank all the wine. They were even getting drunk. So then when the poor church members of the Church of Corinth came. All the food's gone, all the wine's gone, and there are a bunch of drunk church members there. And that was causing issues, not only because it was dividing the church, because they were eating without the rest of the church, but also it was abusing communion itself. It's supposed to be a unifying meal, and there's some Corinthians that were abusing communion, and it was actually causing division. D, Paul had addressed the issue of sexual immorality. Like we talked about, Corinth was a very sexually immoral place. They had sex with practically everything. So as they now begin to follow Jesus, they have to follow Jesus and repent of sexual immorality, and they are to go about sexuality in a way that God has created and saved them to go about it. It's going to be a steep learning curve for some of these guys. And so in the Corinthian church, you can read here in 1 Corinthians 5, there was a guy, it says, Paul says this, he says, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. Now, it's not just regular sexual immorality. It's not just a guy sleeping with his girlfriend or something like that, which is sin. But this guy, a special case, he says this, and the sexual immorality is of a kind that is not even tolerated among the pagans. So the pagans were looking at this sexual immorality happening with this guy, and they're like, ew, we wouldn't even do that. What was this guy doing? Paul says it here. For a man has his father's wife. And at this point, I'll pause the video, let you throw up. There was a young man who was sleeping with most likely his stepmother. He was sharing her with his dad. And you might think that's gross. And Paul thought that too. He goes, that's gross. And the pagans, even in Corinth, were like, that's gross. Paul says this, and you were arrogant. So the Corinthian church saw this sexual immorality happening, and they were arrogant. How is arrogance? I'd think they'd be grossed out. They'd be arrogant. They're proud. Proud of what? Well, I think what was happening is the Corinthians thought, you know what? Jesus is all about mercy and grace, and this guy is kind of a weirdo. He's sleeping with his stepmom, but we'll be merciful and gracious to him. So we'll let him serve in the church. We'll let him take communion with us. We'll let him be a part of the church family. And look at how merciful we are. Look at how forgiving we are. Paul says, you guys are completely missing this point. Yes, mercy and grace, but it is never merciful. It is never gracious to overlook people's unrepentant sin. So Paul says, here's what he says to them. Look back in the passage. Ought you not rather mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. He says, if this guy doesn't turn away from his sin, then you need to excommunicate him from the church. He needs to be removed from the church. We'll talk about that more in a lecture to come. What does that look like when someone's removed from a church? E, he has to deal with the sin of suing believers. Read 1 Corinthians 6, pause, and you'll see, go ahead and read that right now. Now that you've read that, you'll see that the Corinthian believers were actually having lawsuits against one another, and that's a problem because, again, the family of Christ is to be united. It's not good to sue family members. It doesn't really create unity in the church. So you can see, guys, the Corinthian church was a mess. I'll talk more about this later, but sometimes we think, oh man, if only we lived in the early church. They really were serious about Jesus, and they really were holy. When you read 1 Corinthians, you realize, man, my church may be bad, but it's probably not this bad. There's probably a good chance that in your church, a guy's not sleeping with his stepmom. There's not any ongoing lawsuits between believers. No one's getting drunk at communion. And so, does the church have weaknesses today? Absolutely, but it did in the first century as well. Right? Christians struggle with sin. We fight against sin. Sometimes following Jesus it's a process. It takes a while. But as long as we have humble repentance, where in our hearts we hate sin and are turning away from it, we have a bright future because we have a bright Savior. But the early church struggled with sin just as much as the modern church does. Here's number 3, the third reason. So Paul writes to answer their questions, to deal with their sin issues. Number 3, to deal with their bad theology. They had bad thoughts about God. They needed correction in the way they thought about God. Here is 4 specific things that he corrects concerning their theology, their beliefs about God. A, their bad theology about marriage, sexuality, and divorce. They had some bad thoughts. You could read the passage there, but they needed some understanding as to what marriage is, what it isn't, and how to think about divorce as Christians. B, their bad theology about idol food. See, in Corinth, there was lots of temples to pagan gods. Sometimes some meat would be dedicated to a particular god, and then the whole meat wouldn't be consumed. And so they'd say, well, we got this meat, and they'd sell it at the market, usually at cheaper rates. And so Christians would go to the market, and they're like, oh, the idol food is cheap. So some Christians were struggling, what do we do with this idol food? Can we buy a steak that was dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite, or should we stay away from it because it's been offered to idols? Paul unpacks that, 1 Corinthians 8. He corrects their theology about spiritual gifts. The Corinthians were really pumped by the idea that God was empowering them with particular gifts or ministries, and they were beginning to use those gifts or see those gifts exclusively in how it helped them rather than how it helped the church. So he helps their theology about spiritual gifts. And then D, he helps correct their bad theology about the resurrection. They were being tempted to believe that Christ didn't raise from the dead. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul addresses that at length, helping them understand the resurrection is not something that you mess with or reject. It is central to Christianity. All right, D, when was 1 Corinthians written? You can, by looking at the Acts passage and the 1 Corinthians passage, we see that 1 Corinthians was written just probably right after Gamaliel was proconsul of Achaia, because he was proconsul in 51 to 52 AD. And we know that he was in Corinth at that time, or around that time. And so just write this down in the springtime. This is, when was it written? Number 2, in the springtime from AD 53 to 55. So given the biblical information we have, it was written sometime in the spring of AD 53 to 55. It's therefore one of the earliest letters, if not the earliest letter that we have in the New Testament. All right, how was it written? You have the outline in front of you. There's a couple matters to fill in. First, the introduction, first 9 verses. And then from chapter 1 to chapter 6, point 2, Paul addresses the matters of sin. So first he gets to the issues of their sins that they're dealing with, correcting their sin. 3, from chapter 7 to chapter 11, the letter, Paul answers specific questions concerning the Corinthians letter. So this is actually where he goes, okay, now concerning this question, concerning that question. And he answers their questions concerning marriage, divorce, engaged people, widows, food offered to idols. Number 4, Paul addresses matters of church worship, chapters 11 to 14. And then 5th, Paul addresses matters about the resurrection in chapter 15. And then you can look at how the rest of the letter is outlined there. All right. So that, my friends, is the nuts and bolts of 1 Corinthians. And so in our next video, we are going to hit the main themes of 1 Corinthians. And get ready, because there's some really, really awesome stuff in Corinthians to chew on. All right. Have a great day.